Okay, so moving on to the ecological indicators. First one we'll talk about is the sensitive ecosystem areas. So again, we identified those in the landscape. And what we wanted to do here is look at area that was disturbed around those sensitive ecosystem areas. So any polygon that had at least 25% of a sensitive ecosystem identified there if there was harvesting around it. So what we found that was in the status quo, there was about 400 hectares on average that were being disturbed by the surrounding harvest. And then that dropped down to 150 in the reduced harvest scenario, and it was zero in the active conservation and passive scenarios. So then we looked at the disturbed area in key watersheds. This is another indicator. So the watersheds that we were looking at was the Bonsall Creek and the Chemainus watersheds. And so we recognize that the municipal forest land base is only a small part of the overall watersheds, particularly for the Chemainus one, but we wanted to still at least account for the impact of the activities in that area on that watershed. So again, we looked at, so the assumption we made was that an area that was harvested, it would take about 30 years for that area to recover hydrologically following harvest. And so that area would still be, would gradually reduce in its impact to the hydrology over time. So making that assumption, we looked at the average over the simulation period, and we found that about, in the status quo scenario, it was about 330 hectares that were disturbed, which is about 15% of the whole watershed area within the landscape. And that dropped down to only 8% in the reduced harvest and 1% in the active conservation scenario. So I just want to point out that when we start to summarize these scenarios in the end, we do take into account these different relationships in area and disturbance, and we use those to quantify them later. And so you'll see what I mean when we get to the last part. Next.